Interactive documents are a fantastic choice when you want to create a web app that has mostly text in it, but also a few interactive elements. You know, stuff where the user can click on stuff or do things. And instead of creating a full-fledged app using Shiny or Streamlit or whatever else you use to create apps, instead of going down that rabbit hole, you might be able to get the exact same results in a quicker way using interactive documents. And in today's video, I'm going to show you how to build such a thing using Quarto and Shiny. I'm using R Shiny here, but you're also able to do the exact same thing with PyShiny. So whatever your favorite data science language is, you can follow the exact same strategy. So let me show you how that works. In this document, we have mostly text, we have some emojis, text boxes, regular text, some text on a grid, and then we also have an interact part where we can change stuff and therefore everything is recalculated. And then afterwards we have some more text, but the point here is that we do want to have interactive things, but most of this document is just regular text, so it makes sense to not throw all of this into one full-fledged app, but instead use a document that has some interactive parts. And to do so, I've created a blank Quarto file that we can just fill with the text that we see in our app. So if we scroll up here, we see that the headline is Quarto and Shiny interactive documents. Let's throw this into the title. Then we see that we have made with heart using Quarto and Shiny. All right, let's throw this in there. Let's also throw in the text from the text box. And then let's start copying all of the stuff here. Here we see that we have some horizontal line. In Markdown, we can just throw these by throwing these 3 dashes. And then we have a headline called extra information. So let's throw this in there using Markdown notation. And then here, let's just copy the 5 titles that we have. This isn't currently on the grid, or at least it will not render to the grid that we see here. But for now, let's just get all of the text components that we need. And then the sentence is always the same. Then we can throw in another horizontal rule. And then we have another headline called interactive part. In there is where the interactive part is. And then afterwards, we have another horizontal line. And then we have another headline called contact information. And then here we have a disclaimer how to reach us. So let's throw this in here. And while we're at it, we can also make this into Markdown notation, so that when someone clicks on this, it actually opens up an email program to send an email. So now if we render this, we see that we have all the stuff in here, but of course this doesn't look exactly like we want yet. Let's not worry about this part for now. Let's focus on creating the interactive part. For that, we need to throw in a couple of code chunks. The first code chunk is just a code chunk to set everything up. Here we want to load the bslib package as well as the ggplot2 package. We don't need to load the Shiny package, and you might find that odd, but the reason why this happens is because once we go from this HTML format to a Shiny output, then Quarto will automatically load Shiny. So it's technically not necessary to load it. So if we now execute this, we see our code chunks, and we also have these warnings here. We can get rid of them by throwing in a context setup. And then we can also throw in a warning false and a message false. And that way the messages are gone, but the code chunk is still there. But don't worry, the moment we make this into a Shiny document, all things that have context set up or code chunks in general, they will not be included in the output. For now, let's throw in another code chunk where we can throw in the user interface, this sidebar layout that we have seen before. Here we just use the layout sidebar function, and then we can specify the sidebar using the sidebar function. And in there we stick in all the things that we want to use in our sidebar. In our render document, we can see that it's a select input where we can change species and a slider input where we can change the minimum weight the penguins are supposed to have. And the nice thing about this layout is that it can toggle this sidebar here. So what we need to do now is to throw in inputs from the Shiny package. Here we start with the selectize input, where we first, as always in Shiny, have to specify an ID for this input. Let's call it select species. Then we need a title. Let's call it highlighted species. And then we throw in the choices and the selected values for this input. But we also have to make sure that we also allow multiple choices. And then we do a similar thing for the slider input. Namely, we specify an ID, then we specify a title, and then we fill in the input specific arguments like the minimum, the maximum, and the value that is currently selected. And then outside the sidebar into the main content, we can just for now throw in a string that says main content. And now if we render this, let's see how this looks. We first see the code chunk, and then we see the inputs here. This doesn't look as nice as we've seen in the final output, output. And the reason why this happens is because Shiny isn't fully loaded yet. And to change that, all we have to do is to make our Quarto document into a Quarto document that also has a server that is Shiny. And now if we try to render this again, we see that things now work out. So now we can change things here and the inputs look nicer. Now what we can do is to change the main content to have an actual placeholder for a plot that is supposed to be rendered. So let's from the Shiny package use the plot output function, and in there let's specify an output ID. And now if we re-render this, we see that currently the main content is blank. And to fix that, we have to actually render the output that has this ID here. And for that, we're going to create a new code chunk. And since this is supposed to be code that might need to be re-executed as users interact with the document, we need to tell Quarto that this is not a run once kind of thing, but it has to always check if things change. And that's why we have to throw in a context that says server. That way Quarto will know that everything that happens inside of this code chunk is supposed to be run in an interactive Shiny kind of way. So as is typical in Shiny, we have to modify the output that has this ID, and there we have to set it to the render plot function from Shiny. All we have to do in this code block is to generate the code that generates the plot output. So here we have to create the code that generates this plot here. It is a scatter plot of the penguins dataset from the Parma penguins package. So here we have to take this penguins dataset and then pass it to ggplot, where we specify the aesthetics, namely on the x-axis we want to map the bill length, on the y-axis we want to have the flipper length, and for the fill color of the points we want to use the species. And then we throw a GM point layer on top of that to generate the points, and we modify that the things are actually using shape 21, which means that there are filled points and not just regular points, so that the fill aesthetic actually does something. And then we modify the size and the color, and then we can render this, and now we see that we have a plot here. Just in case you're confused, let me mention here the color in this case refers to the outline of the points. This is why we have shape 21, which has an outline color and the fill color. The fill color is what we map via the aesthetics. The outline color is what we map or hard code using the colors argument. And now the plot doesn't do anything because, well, we haven't actually used the inputs, but let's get there in a second. For now, I do want to make this plot a little bit nicer. If you're new to this channel, then you might not notice, but I can't stand leaving the default values in a plot as is. So that's why we should go through a couple of quick changes to make things look nicer. We start by modifying the labels so that we have proper labels for all the things that are displayed there. So now we have a title, we have nice axis labels, and we have a nice label for our legend. Then we can throw in a theme minimal to change the base size and the font family, so that way everything is larger and the font is nicer. Also, I do want to change the colors, and I set them to colors from the colorblind friendly Okabe Ito color palette, and that way things look hopefully a bit nicer. Finally, this is a technical thing. We do need to make sure that the coordinate system always uses the same axes. When you later modify the data that is passed into the ggplot, the axis might shift, and that's why we do want to have this hard-coded here. But this doesn't change the output right now at all. So now let's try to make sure that something happens when we use these inputs here. Right now everything still is as is. And the way to do that is to actually use the inputs that we have specified here. And we can do so by taking this data set here and passing it to the filter function before it goes into ggplot. There we specify that we only want to use the species that are inside the input with the ID select species, which is the ID of this input that chooses the species. And then we want to do the exact same thing with the body mass G column inside of this data set to make sure that we only show penguins that have a weight that is larger than the input with the ID slider weight, which is in this case the one that we have specified here. And now if we re-execute this, or rather re-render this, then we see that things change. And the same thing works with the species as well. And if we look at this document here, then we see that right now this interactive part has the exact width of all the other text. In our original document, we have seen that the extra information as well as the interactive part is wider than the other stuff. And this is where Quarto comes in, because it makes it really easy to change the widths of specific parts. All you have to do is to go into the code chunk that generates the UI and then throw in a column and set it to page. And now if we re-render this, then you see that things are wider. The same thing can be done with this part here. Namely, we could just wrap this into a div container using Quarto notation. And in there, we can use the column page. This will throw everything that comes between these colons into a div container with the class column page, and this CSS class makes everything a little bit wider. So in this code chunk, we want to have everything on a grid, and we can make it look like this by using a little bit of HTML and CSS magic. Since this will involve a lot of repetitive code because the HTML and CSS is basically supposed to look the exact same thing for each and every title, we can use a little bit of code logic to generate the HTML and CSS for us. So let's create a new code chunk and let's collect these things here in a data set. Let's create a new table. And in there we can first create a headings column that just contains the titles here. But of course we have to wrap these into quotation marks, otherwise R will complain. And then we can also create a text column that just has this placeholder text here. And that way, if we look at this, we see that we now have a data set that has the headings here and also the text here. So what we can do now is to pass this to the mutate function from the dplyr package to modify these columns. Namely, I want to take the headings column and modify that using the map function from the per package, where we stick in the headings column as arguments, and as a function, we use a custom function that uses the HTML tools package, and in there sticks everything into a div container. But we also want to make sure that the headings are bold, so we also make sure that we stick the argument into the strong tag. And that way, if you re-execute this, you see now that these are HTML and CSS tags. Similarly, we can do the exact same thing for the regular text, but there things are a little bit easier because we just have to throw this into a div container. No need to make anything bold, so we can just leave it like that. Finally, we want to combine these things into one container. Let's create a column that we call combined, and there we use the per package again and the map function, but this time the map2 function, because we want to iterate over two columns, namely the headings column and the text column. And there we specify once again a custom function, this time with two arguments, and in there we use the HTML tools package to create a div container, which will be filled with first the heading and then the text. But we also want to make sure that this div container has a bit of styling, and that's why we throw in the style argument here, and we fill it with the HTML tools package using the CSS function. And for now, all we want to do is to make sure that each container has a width of 300 pixels. Otherwise, this div container would fill everything up. Now, if we look at this, we see that we have a data set that has a bunch of tags in there. So let's save this into a variable that we call tip tags. And now we can take this data set and get the combined column from it, and then we stick this into a div container. And if we were to execute this, we see that this just generates the HTML code that corresponds to the grid here. But in order to make sure that HTML and CSS actually put the containers next to each other and not on top of each other, we have to make sure that we style the outer div container here using CSS again. And there we just say that it's supposed to use a flex display and wrap things around when the width doesn't suffice to contain all of the div containers. And that way everything looks exactly the same in the output, except for that we have a styling here now. And now if we render this HTML will actually become something that looks nice. Well, it doesn't look exactly nice yet because everything is kind of crammed together. And we can fix this really easily by throwing in margins on the right of every container and at the bottom of every container. And now if we re-render this, we see that this actually looks more like a grid. But I don't like that this headline is as close to the content as it is right now. So that's why I'm using a little bit of style instructions in the markdown notation here. Quarto allows us to throw in these curly brackets style arguments, and in there we can just use regular CSS to modify things on the fly. And now if we re-render this, we see now that we do have more space after the headline. Alright, cool. Now we have this grid here, we have our interactive part done. Now we have to make sure that this part here actually looks like we want. If you recall, we had a nice little text box here and everything was center aligned. So let's scroll up all the way to where we have that actual content. And now let's throw everything into a new div container. As we've learned before, Quarto has a notation for that using these three colons here, and then we wrap them separately into these containers. And now I want to assign a custom CSS class to each of those containers. So here let's call the class that we want to assign text box, and here let's just call it banner. If we re-render this, nothing changes because we have never defined style instructions for banner or text box. So that's why we need to modify the theme and we can set it to theme.scss. And I do already have such a file because I've already prepared this video. So let's just call this theme recording. And now if we try to render this, Quarto actually doesn't complain, even though this file doesn't yet exist. So let's create it. So we create a new text file. Let's call it theme recording.scss. Currently it's blank, but now Quarto will most definitely complain because it will say, okay, this SCSS file that you provided, it doesn't have any of these boundary layers. So let's just do Quarto a favor and copy some of them in there because these are also the ones I want to use. They are not strictly necessary. I mean, you have to throw in one of them, but after that, Quarto is happy and you can just throw everything in as is, but still it helps to maintain some structure using these tags here. So now with that out of the way, we can render again. And the nice thing about this SCSS thing is we can change the default values of a lot of predefined custom variables that change the appearance of the document. For example, we can redefine the primary color to something green. We can change the background color of the body from white to something else. And then we can make sure that all headings use this primary color and they also use bold text. And now if we save this and re-render our Quarto document, then everything looks different. Now this background has a very subtle shade of green and the headlines are green as well. So the nice thing is that you can define one theme for your company or wherever you want to use this and then reuse it for all the other interactive documents that you want to create. Similarly, just to make sure that the output matches what we have in our final output, let's just make sure that we use the specific font sizes and the font that I want to use. And now if we re-render this, things look once again a bit different. Not too much different, but still a little bit different. And now that I see this in here, for some reason I do have the title twice in here. Let's just fix this immediately. Alright, cool. Back to our classes that we haven't defined styles for. Let's start with the banner. This one is really easy to do. All we have to do is to target div containers with the class banner. And in there, we specify that we want to have text align and we want to make sure that everything center aligns. This works pretty nicely because it's just a single line of text here. Now, if we re-execute this, we see that it looks like this now. We could also make sure that the font size is set to 12 points. That way it became a little bit smaller. And we can do the exact same thing for this text box here. So let's create a new rule for div containers having the class text box. And there we can start with a couple of easy changes like changing the background color, making sure that it uses bold text, and then using white color and making sure that this whole box only has a width of 400 pixels. We see now that we have a text box. It doesn't look exactly like we want yet, but we do see how this is already taking the shape of the text box that we want. We can additionally make sure that we have a black border with 1 pixel width. We do want to make sure that we have round corners, and we do want to make sure that the text is a little bit further inside of the box and doesn't go all the way to the edge of the box, and that's why we add a little bit of padding on all sides. And now, re-executing this, we see that things are once again getting closer to what we want. The remaining thing that we need to do is to make sure that we do alignment properly. And for that, we want to make sure that we have, as a display, we have flex. And then to make things auto align in the center, we can just use margin left and set it to auto. And we can margin right and set that to auto as well. And now if we re-render this, we see that things are center aligned now. But the margins don't look quite right, so let's throw in a little bit of margin at the bottom. That way the following text block has some more space to it. And then just to make things pop out a little bit more, we can throw in a shadow. There we just throw in the filter argument and set it to drop shadow. And then if we re-render this, then we have our nice little text box here. And with that, our interactive document is finished. It has some nice custom styling to it. It has a lot of text. It has elements arranged on a grid. And most importantly, it also has some interactive part. So we can change the minimum weight here and things change in the plot. And the same thing goes for all the species. And of course, we can minimize the sidebar layout if we want that. All right, with that, we've covered how to create interactive documents. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know in the comments if you did. And if you want to see more of my content, you might want to check out this playlist here. And now all that's left to say is thank you for watching and I will see you next time.